I want to find out how you envisage these proposals working with regard to three key areas. The role of Stormont, the Executive and the Assembly, customs arrangements, and Northern Ireland remaining in the single market for all goods. Now, is that point, being in the single market for goods for Northern Ireland, is that your compromise?
It is. It shows that we're being creative and flexible, that we're responding to concerns that have been raised by the EU. And the EU themselves said that both sides need to be creative and flexible as we address the issues on the border of Northern Ireland. So we've been very clear that we stand by our commitments to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. There'll be no infrastructure on the border. But the issue with the backstop was that there was the risk of laws applying in Northern Ireland over which people wouldn't have a vote. And therefore, the regulatory zone that is proposed alongside a consent mechanism, because it is important that if we are going to have a regulatory zone, you have consent to go with it.
I'll come to that consent mechanism in a moment. But the effect of this idea of Northern Ireland remaining in the single market for goods would mean that if we reach a free trade agreement, for example, with the United States, any goods under that agreement could not enter Northern Ireland.
Well, the backstop was always a bridge into a future relationship, and so would fall away once you had the future economic partnership. The point is, it's a bridge into a relationship that is at odds with the position of the new...
I'm talking about agreements reached with other parts of the world, as we would want to do after Brexit.
No, well, we've been clear. So one key aspect of the proposal is that the whole of the United Kingdom leaves entire and whole. The Prime Minister has been very clear on that, and therefore, as part of any future trade deals, the customs union element, the concerns around the customs arrangements, we've been very clear in the proposals on that. So the whole of the United Kingdom would come out of the customs union, but clearly the issue with the backstop was it would have fallen away in any event in a future economic partnership.
I don't think I've got an answer to my specific question about if we reach a free trade agreement with the United States and there are goods included in that are different to what is allowed in the EU single market, they could not enter Northern Ireland. Is that correct?
No, all areas of the United Kingdom would be within the area of a trade zone. Now, if there were specific aspects of that trade deal relating to agriculture, then the standards that would apply would obviously need to be managed in terms of the consent mechanism as to what the community in Northern Ireland had agreed to.
This is
in
about
terms
all
of them
goods,
going
though,
into,
not just agri-foods.
Indeed, but it would be within the consent mechanism that applies to Northern Ireland.
So when you say consent mechanism, you are talking about the role of that is envisaged for Stormont, for the Executive and the Assembly, correct?
That's right.
You are placing a great deal of emphasis on institutions that haven't been sitting for 2.5 years.
Yeah, but I think it is important, and so there are other aspects of the proposal from the Prime Minister that speaks to that. For example, the New Deal for Northern Ireland that is set out in that proposal. And we think it is important that we get
You're
the executive...
Money will encourage those institutions to get up and running again.
Well, it's about more than that. It's about looking at the infrastructure in Northern Ireland. It's looking at how we put in place aspects that are supportive of the all-Ireland economy. And that is part of a much wider approach the Prime Minister is taking to levelling up the United Kingdom as a whole. And it's absolutely right that as part of that levelling up of the United Kingdom, we look at what is the impact on the economy in Northern Ireland. There's many challenges more widely to the economy in Northern Ireland.
And
the Prime Minister, as part of a wider agenda,
significant figure in the business community in Northern Ireland earlier on the programme saying the best thing for them would have been to remain under the arrangements that were previously envisaged, the backstop, which would have been the best for their economy. I want to ask you this about the Stormont. No, because you were saying about getting the institutions back up and running. This letter that the Prime Minister has sent to Jean-Claude Juncker says that the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly should have the opportunity to endorse these arrangements before they enter into force. That is during the transition period. Now, if there's a deal on the basis of that, that's 3 weeks away.
But the point around the backstop, and many of the people that come on your programme say that they prefer to have the backstop's been rejected.
I'm sorry,
3 times,
I'm not asking about that. I'm saying, how is it conceivable that these institutions are going to get up and running before the transition period comes into effect, which is in 3 weeks' time if there is a deal?
Well, the proposal's not seeking to do that. The proposal is putting a consent mechanism in place for the implementation period, not to be in place by the 31st of October.
It says an opportunity to endorse these arrangements before they enter into force.
But the consent mechanism will apply up to 6 months before the end of the implementation period, which would enable the further work that is going on.
Towards the middle of next year. All right.
Indeed.
And every 4 years afterwards.
Correct.
Which would mean there would be this period of uncertainty every 4 years, wouldn't there? Something that that Fianna Fáil, the Irish opposition party, described to us an hour ago as very serious, that it throws up a whole constitutional debate for people north and south of the border every 4 years, that is deeply destabilising and not in line with the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, your point supports an argument that the UK government has made throughout this process, is that these issues should have been dealt with as part of the future economic relationship and not as part of the winding down provisions. And the issue is that we've been trying to address what the future economic relationship would be as part of discussions on the withdrawal agreement, which is the winding down arrangement. So it is important that the 4 years sits with a term in terms of the installment. That's why it's been set at that, and it's important there is democratic consent.
Can you not see how bringing that up every 4 years it brings about tremendous uncertainty, potentially even becomes a dangerous flashpoint given Northern Ireland's history?
No, I don't, because it is something that will be shaped by the future economic relationship, which is still to come, and we need to get on to those trade deals. We haven't even got on to the future trade deal because of the way that the talks were sequenced. So it is important. The key issue here is how do we get into the implementation period and enable the free trade agreement discussions to move forward. That is the key issue, which will then shape what the trading arrangements are between the UK, including Northern Ireland, and the rest of the EU. And in terms of what is then proposed in the consent mechanism, that will obviously be part of that wider discussion.
The third area I wanted to talk to you about is customs arrangements. Now, you envisage a customs border of some kind. They, the EU, don't want one at all. Now, everyone can see how trusted traders can be dealt with. The problem is other traders. How would you check them? How would you make sure there are checks that prevent smuggling? Where would those checks take place?
Well, again, there's detail in the paper on that in terms of trusted trader schemes. There's schemes already in place around consignees and how they can operate.
I just said I'd not trusted traders. The other ones, the rogues.
Well, I mean,
where are you going to check for them?
It's about what is proportionate, and most smuggling operations aren't actually addressed at a border. Most smuggling is actually addressed in terms of intelligence, in terms of information sharing, in terms of close partnership between the various agencies, and we have very good relationships with the Irish government in that event. And indeed, there's smuggling now on the border, and it is addressed in terms of intelligence-led operations. So that is exactly proportionate. It is important that if we have a small trader exemption, many of the most difficult areas are addressed through that. But intelligence operations is how smuggling is usually addressed. It's not usually addressed through checks at a border. And because of our commitment to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, we're clear we're not going to have infrastructure at the border. Okay.
What about other issues that are going to be potentially an issue for some of those who voted against the withdrawal agreement repeatedly, the European Research Group, backbench Brexiteer MPs? Bernard Jenkins told us earlier that one of his continuing concerns is the role of the European Court of Justice during the transition, including us being bound by new laws and the divorce bill. Are both of those as they were in the last withdrawal agreement and political declaration?
Well, there is a continued role for the ECJ in terms of the regulatory zone as part of these proposals, and that is one of the areas that we have been willing to be creative and flexible on. But it is crucially with the consent of the community in Northern Ireland, and I think that's the issue. I think the concern with the backstop was this aspect of laws applying over which people had no say. And so the key issue is, yes, there is, and this is why we have been willing to be creative and flexible. That is an illustration of that. That is why the Commission are treating this as a serious set of proposals. When I spoke to Michel Barnier yesterday, he said he wanted time to consider them. He recognised that there had been movement from the UK government.
In private, he said to be absolutely scathing about these proposals and regards them as unworkable.
Well, I mean, I can only go by the conversation I had with him yesterday and that the teams had with Task Force 50 and those discussions, and it was very much that these are serious serious proposals. And indeed, Adam Fleming on your programme earlier today said exactly that. So that was what Adam Fleming was reporting earlier on the programme.
When will the formal negotiations then begin if everything is so positive?
Well, we need to move forward at pace, intensively. Task Force 50 want to look at the proposals today, and then we expect to be into talks in the coming days immediately after that.
By the weekend?
Yes.
And if they haven't begun by the weekend, does that tell us that this is not going to fly?
Well, I think the response from the Commission was they recognised that these are serious proposals, and I think all sides want to see a deal. All sides recognise that the alternative no deal is disruptive. In the event of no deal, Ireland would have to put in place measures to protect the integrity of the single market, and we want to avoid that and work with the EU in order that the UK can leave in a smooth and orderly way. And the Commission recognise that, and that's very much the spirit in which the Prime Minister has set out these proposals.
Steve Barclay.